Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, host of the Weekly Worldview. It's good to be with you again, Fred, talking about real science on Friday.
Yeah, and boy, is that going to be appropriate for this show. So, Doug, we promised a show on the pyramids with our guest host, Ryan Williams. We're going to actually push that out 2 weeks because we have a show we want to do today to answer NPR's show from just this last Friday, August 4th. They did a segment on Ask the Expert. So we want to do a rebuttal to that show and talk about the things they mentioned with evolution. So this is like the latest. They got their expert who's going to talk about evidence for evolution, and then they take a few callers. And Real Science Radio, we want to address those claims. So look for the Pyramid Show in 2 weeks. Next week, Doug, we already had scheduled Dr. Phil Dennis, and I can't wait to do that show. He's a physicist from the University of Missouri, and that's going to be a ton of fun. But let's take on NPR.
Yes. I actually heard the show. It was last Friday. That's August 4th, 2023, for those of you who might be listening later on the podcast. NPR's Science Friday had a segment titled Ask an Expert on Evolution Education.
So ask the expert.
Ask an expert.
Yeah. So leave it to NPR I guess they never got the memo that experts are really no longer in fashion, Doug. And, the most famous ones are now they're being asked questions by congressional committees. But since they hung the word expert out there, we were really enticed to actually, we feel obliged to address this so-called expert. And what we're going to do in this show, Doug, is we're going to provide for each point that he brings up and when he addresses listeners call-in questions, we're going to provide a point-by-point rebuttal, and we'll also provide a link to the RSR page that refutes it. And that's going to be a ton of fun. I'm looking forward to getting into this. Actually, Doug, this is, after all, we are Real Science Radio on Friday.
we offer Real Science Friday. Anyway, Fred, no, but I did got to ask, how did you come to listen to the Science Friday segment, Fred? Are you a regular listener? Are you a valued NPR sustaining member, Fred? Do they still do the tote bag, or do you just get a mark on your forehead these days?
Yeah. So no, I'm actually not a regular listener to NPR, and I don't go to their store and buy their tote bag or whatever they have. But what happened was a good friend of mine, he likes to listen to that show. He likes to compare their show to our show. And so he let me know about what they were talking about. And, they talked about, hey, do chimps in the zoo become men? And I thought it was funny. So I went back and listened to the show. I'm like, you know what? We do need to address this. So this friend of mine, Dr. Ralph Kwan, he actually has, his degree is in aerospace engineering. And he currently works on firmware for satellites, but he got his degree from CU Boulder, again, in aerospace engineering. And it's always fun to get his perspective on some of these shows. So he actually was a listener who called me up and said, hey, you guys got to hear this show. So
all right. Well,
sounded like a good thing to take on.
Oh yeah. Sounds like a hoot, Fred. And just in case anyone missed last week's Science Friday over at NPR, the host, Ira Flatow, introduced the show, and just to set the mood, Fred, his voice, this is just my opinion, his voice is sort of a halting, higher-pitched version of Howard Stern, if you've ever heard Howard Stern. And he set up his interview by saying he was offering, quote, an evolution education, a bit of biology 101.
Yeah, so he talks about biology 101, and Doug, I'm pretty sure biology 101 has existed long before even Darwin, at least 300 years before he came along. And of course, the Bible, it presents the earliest explanations of things like zoology, botany, biology, things like the germ theory of disease. That was all biblically based. So Ira Flatow, our buddy over there at NPR, he was correct in that he was only covering a bit of Biology 101.
I love it. Ira Flatow. Very, very well. Anyway, Fred, and you know something about evolution is it's the bit of alleged biology that's proven to be the least necessary in the advancement of the field of biology, and certainly the least necessary in the advancement of medicine. That little evolutionary theory bit.
Yeah. So his guest on the show, he's the author of a book with an interesting title, Explaining Life Through Evolution. Now, Doug, I haven't read the book and I probably won't, but I guarantee it does not actually explain life. It's certainly not going to explain the origin of life. And in fact, he admits that later in the show, in the NPR episode on Ask the Expert, that they don't really have a clue about the origin of life. So the title of his book, again, Explaining Life Through Evolution, it reminded me of an old axiom of the late, great Bob Enyart, where he said this: the most popular evolutionist is the one who can say the greatest absurdity with the straightest face. And, you know, his guest is fairly popular in the field of evolutionary genetics. And well, let me say that differently, Doug. He's actually an expert in the field of evolutionary apologetics.
So you mean evolutionary biology?
Well, no, I actually mean apologetics, you know, after I thought about it.
Oh.
And, you know, you'll see what I mean as we go through this interview after listening to it. So this guy, his name is Dr. ProSanta Chakrabarty. And it's interesting, the spelling, when you look it up and the pronunciation, it's Dr. ProSanta. So I thought, well, he's ProSanta is fitting because like pro fairy tale, you know, because I hate to bring it to the audience, but Santa is not really real. But anyways, this guy, he's a full professor and the curator of fishes at the Museum of Natural Science and the Department of Biological Science at Louisiana State University. Okay. And he uses a really bad analogy about his expertise in fish that we're going to get to later on clownfish. And I think clownfish is the appropriate word to use. Anyways.
Yes. Well, we'll get to the good doctor. We'll get to all the topics on the show. But before we do that, I got to tell you, Fred, listening to the episode of Science Friday, Fred, within 30 seconds, I was reminded how I've always just been almost instinctively repulsed by NPR. So I'm listening to the show on my computer and I had to fight the urge to change the channel. I've developed this my finger goes out to hit the button on the car stereo. It's like automatic, you know? So Flatow starts out with we're headed back into the classroom. We were all taught about evolution in science class, but how much do you remember? And what questions do you have now that you were afraid to ask the teacher back then? You know, he's got that he ends it, he says it like it's all, he's got this fake light humor and he ends with a fake little chuckle. Like his intro is just something that he just casually tossed off the top of his head. You know, it's like, you should feel like you're all among friends here. And of course, this is all understood to be everybody's universal experience and belief. And the only question would be, how well do you remember the particulars of your belief experience? And do you have more questions about it? You know, questions you might have been afraid to ask back then.
Afraid. Yeah. So
afraid. Yeah.
You know, Doug, you were absolutely right that this is difficult it was definitely difficult for me to stomach this thing, listening to it.
Yeah.
But we need to. It's a part of our research and we want to answer the questions there. So you and I were talking offline about this show and you mentioned that I thought was such a great insight that his introduction is this classic Marxist oratory construct. Yep. And the design is to simultaneously intimidate and isolate anybody with a differing experience. So for example, the discussion will be questions about evolution, not a questioning of evolution. And notice how he casually drops in the idea that we just kind of mocked about being afraid.
Yeah.
Maybe you were afraid to ask back then. I know I wasn't afraid to ask questions, Doug. I might have been shy or just didn't feel like it or bored, but I wasn't sitting there, oh, I'm afraid, Doug. What am I going to do? Why would he imply that anybody would be afraid?
Well, I'll tell you, Fred, that's Ira practicing classic psychological manipulation. He's reminding his listeners of the fear that maybe they felt when they were kids and the teacher told them about evolution and mutations and how we're related to chimpanzees, and it didn't match what the kid thought maybe happened, or it didn't match what they heard at church or what grandma said, and maybe they did have questions, but they were intimidated back then, and they kept their mouths shut. I remember this, Fred. I remember feeling this way, and Ira wants to remind everybody in the audience about that. Fred, Ira's introduction didn't just come off the top of his head with a little chuckle at the end. His whole introduction is steeped in Marxist psychological intimidation. And if it did come off the top of his head, he's one of Karl Marx's greatest ambassadors.
Yeah. He continues in that vein, Doug. It was such a good insight on your part. So he openly introduced this so-called science lesson it's a politically motivated exercise. So the first thing he does is he asks the good doctor if he was motivated to write his science book because of what Flatow calls the anti-evolution laws. For example, the one passed, I think it's been 15 years ago in Louisiana. And, back then that professor was just a green assistant professor at Louisiana State University. I think it's a stretch to try to connect an author with a book that is supposed to be about science, and it's coming out next week, to legislation passed 15 years ago, Doug, when the professor was just starting out.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Well, Fred, keep Flatow's psychological intimidation game in mind. I mean,
while we go through this.
Yeah, that's Ira's way of reminding the good professor about just what got him here for his big interview on NPR with his big book coming out. Ira's going to make sure that the good doctor acknowledges publicly that he picked political sides, that he picked the right side, and Ira's reinforcing the idea that everyone listening is all on the same side, and we all share the same belief, and we're all real good friends, having a little chuckle about it, right? Right? So tell us, Doc, was your book put out for the right side and for the right reason? Say you're one of us out loud, Doctor. Even though the politics have no bearing on the science, and certainly no bearing on your book, Doctor, and certainly no bearing on your career or your position. Say it, Doctor.
Yeah. And he does say it, Doug. I mean, he comes right out and he loyally acknowledges that the book was meant to address, these anti-evolution laws, not just in Louisiana, but he mentions India and Turkey, that they don't teach evolution now. And it's as if Louisiana is like a third world foreign country or something. That was just, that was kind of strange.
Yeah.
And of course they exaggerate things. We know that Louisiana wasn't told not to teach evolution at all, but there's going to be a creation curriculum alongside. So anyways,
So anytime you have to acknowledge that evolution is a theory, the evolutionists say you're banning evolution. And it's just, so they spend the first 5 minutes of a half-hour science segment basically positioning it with the politics.
Oh, absolutely. And, like right out of the gate, I remember they say those who question evolution, no amount of data will change their mind. And also they say it's how scientists understand it, as if they have this hold on the entire scientific community. And it's interesting that they say no amount of data will change their mind. It reminds me of a quote in Discover magazine when Mary Schweitzer first published about the dinosaur soft tissue. And one of the scientists said, no amount of data will convince me that dinosaur soft tissue was found.
Right.
So they're the ones who actually do it. So anyways, we have a link at rsar.org/doubt. So DOUBT. For scientists who question Darwinism. And it's a really neat list that Bob started some years ago. And again, we just mentioned that next week we have a prominent PhD physicist who's also an expert in advanced mathematics. He's going to join us next week, and not from an evolution point of view. His view is that the earth was created roughly 7,000 years ago, and that the God of the Bible is the author of all the design and author of us. He created the world and everything in it. Anyways, he goes on to say, Doug, that it's a trust issue. He thinks they need to go
back to Ira here.
Yeah, and the doctor. They say we need to gain their trust. He says it's because we don't trust them. And, to use the new vernacular LOL, I'm going to laugh out loud at that because We've been doing this show for a long time, Doug, and we have demonstrated over the years how many times that they're wrong on so many things, and then they expect to earn our trust. So I call their theory of evolution, I've always called it a low-grade hypothesis. And one of the things we're going to do, we're going to look into this. There is a widespread acceptance of evolution among plenty of scientists. That's true. We're going to have Dr. Royal Truman back on. Remember, one of the things he wanted to talk about is why are there so many of these guys who believe in evolution? So that'll be a fun show. That's coming up in, I don't know, probably about 3 or 4 weeks. So he's going to give us that perspective. And again, Doug, we at RSR, there is a trust issue. We don't trust what you guys say because you're wrong almost all of the time.
Yeah, and one great example was when Dr. Truman was on Real Science Radio, and he basically shredded evolutionary theory based on the sophistication of cellular binding sites. That was back in April. Yeah, back in April of this year. And now, speaking of April, let's get back to Flatow and Mr. Chakrabarty. Speaking of April, what about March? The March of Progress, that is.
Yeah.
Did you hear when Ira and the good doctor brought up the tragedy of that famous March for Progress mural that we all saw growing up that showed the ape demand progression through the various apes? You remember when that came up?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And they admit that it did more harm than good, and they act like it's good being honest scientists and point this out, that this image was actually not great for evolution. And the reasons they gave is because they said it portrays evolution as goal-oriented, and it also puts humans at the top of the pinnacle of evolution, when they say, well, neither of those are true. That's not what evolution is all about. And after all, we're just apes, Doug. Well, here's the problem I have with that they're not telling their listening audience. They're not being honest. It's intellectual dishonesty. It's because, Doug, none of these images were valid in the first place. I mean, none of them. I repeat, none. As it turns out, even current evolutionists will admit, we can quote them, that not a single one of these was on the family tree for humans. They were not direct ancestors. And even Lucy, that's the one you'll hear about from anybody who's halfway knowledgeable about evolution, and those who just know the buzzwords, they'll say, oh, Lucy proves evolution. Well, even Lucy, Doug, is no longer considered a direct ancestor. So we've had several shows with Brody Leach. He's our RSR expert on, these hominids, on the Smithsonian's Hall of Origins. And he goes through and shows how all of those are very fanciful speculation and really just outright wrong that they're human ancestors. So you can go to that show at rsr.org/apes or rsr.org/apemen. And also, we're going to provide a link to a document by Carl Kirby.
Oh, yeah.
And he's going to show really convincingly, he's going to show this March of Progress and how they actually assigned different ape ancestors to it. And you'll be able to see that in every single case, none of them is on the human tree, the direct descendant of humans. So it's just completely wrong. It's an illusion. And they ask, why is it a trust issue? Well, right out of the gate, because you're not being honest about what that image depicts. You're just saying, well, it doesn't really show, that the humans really aren't at the top because we're just animals and apes and blah, blah.
Oh, you know what, Fred? Now that you say that, at the time when they came up with that fake mural, Ape to Man, at the time when they came up with it, they didn't realize that at some point in the future that claiming that there was a pinnacle of anything would be a problem. So isn't that interesting how the mind back then, they didn't realize how crazy things were going to get.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Doug.
Even the evolutionists in the early 20th century did not realize the depths of madness into which we would have plumbed at this point, not even being able to say that anything can be at a pinnacle, and certainly not man. Man can't be at the pinnacle.
Yeah, exactly. So then we start getting into really the heart of this whole Ask the Expert episode. So he asks this doctor from LSU, how do we know evolution is real? Let's get that right out of the way quickly. And so the good doctor from Louisiana State, he answers this way, quote, sure, for me, the best evidence is that we can look at what we call the tree of life.
What we call the tree of life.
Call.
Yeah, that's interesting right there, Fred. Not only because the evolutionists stole the name of God's tree out of Genesis, first of all, that's pretty pathetic, right? That they're stealing from God, as they always do. So, but listen to the way he answers. So, Fred, if I ask you, how do we know that the argument of the perihelion is real? Fred, would you start your answer with, well, Doug, for me, the best evidence is that we can all look at what we call the math.
Well, Doug, of course not, because mathematics isn't just called mathematics. It is mathematics, and it's not just for me. So it's for everybody. And because the math is real, the argument of the perihelion is real. And it's real not just for me, it's real for everybody.
By the way, that's the definition of real, Fred. Reality has to be real for everybody all the time. If it's not, we've slipped into the realm of madness. And the fact that a full professor is allowed to state what reality is for him, I think that's quite instructive, Fred.
Yeah, so true. And since evolution is still called a theory, and again, I believe it's really just a low-grade hypothesis, he's not able to cite something real to confirm evolution. It's noteworthy right there, Doug. That speaks volumes. But he goes on to talk about the tree of life, and I want to mention that, again, his best evidence is the tree of life, and he says DNA shows it, and he says that we can place fossils on the tree, and that we find them every day that fit the tree. So, Doug, we at Real Science Radio, we have a page on this. Go to rsr.org/tree, or you can go to tree-of-life. You can also go to rsr.org/genomes. And again, they ask why there's a trust issue. Well, let me just read a few of the first items on our page on Darwin was wrong about the tree of life. So this is from New Scientist, and they admitted that Darwin was wrong about the tree of life. That's a secular science journal, or the New Scientist. And there's so much more on this page. We've got a nice long list here. So just go visit that or listen to the show. And again, the other one I mentioned is rsr.org/genome. So I'm going to pull that up. So the list of genomes that just don't fit, and that's a nice long list, Doug. And, one of the things we mentioned is how chromosome Y, it was up to 45% different between chimps and humans. And that one is supposed to be a conserved chromosome. It shouldn't undergo that much change. And so the scientists were shocked. They said it was horrendous. It was a horrendous difference.
Yes.
There's so much. The gorilla DNA is closer to humans than chimps in 15% of the genome. Kangaroo DNA unexpectedly contains huge chunks of the human genome. We could go on and on, Doug. So those are pages right there that refute his whole tree of life, where even New Scientist says Darwin is wrong about the tree of life. So he then argues that we don't have a perfect body. So how many times have we heard that? And, I found on Fox News, they got a list of all these useless organs that all turn out to have a use for him. So we'll provide a page.
Fox News.
Fox shocker, News. Huh?
Oh, no.
So, yeah. So go to rsr.org/useless-organs or rsr.org/I or rsr.org/trochlea. Remember the trochlea challenge, Doug? Where we've got an image, and we're showing that on the video now, but we'll also provide an image of it in the show summary. It's this way that the eye connects. There's this little loop and this sling that helps hold the, like a sling to hold the eye.
Amazing.
Amazing. And it's not only on one eye, it's on both eyes. How does that evolve? How does a little tendon go through this slit and to enable to help hold the eye in place? In this eye,
you have to have millions of years of cross-eyed people and then eventually the left eye finally figures it out.
Yeah. And rsr.org/I, you can also listen to Bob's interview with this eye expert, this evolutionary expert on the eye. And
that was fantastic.
Yeah. And he wrote a book on the eye, and yet he never provides any evidence for evolution of the eye. So
yes. In fact, Fred, I want to suggest that as an almost medical treatment. If you did have to listen to this particular broadcast of Science Friday, if we've piqued your interest and you just had to go listen to it, one of the ways you can recover from that is to listen to Bob Enyart's interview with the so-called eye expert.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Doug, again, we get back to this trust issue. They want us to trust them, yet again and again, they give us reasons not to. And in one part, he says that backs and knees are bad. How is that evidence for evolution?
Yeah, right. And like,
wow.
I understand that some people have a bad back, some people have bad knees, but backs and knees, I mean, they look pretty good to me. I'm glad I have them.
Yeah. I'd rather have a back and knees than not. And yeah,
right?
Over time, we get old and
I don't know. I just don't know where that came from. And that might be why they had to start taking the collars. Fred.
Oh, yeah.
You have to take collars, Fred, because, a half hour can be really tough to fill when you've only got two guys, right? So they immediately, right off the bat, they take the Neanderthal question, right? How do we know that Neanderthals were actually a different species from humans? And, I will credit the good Dr. Fred that he admits that they may not actually be different species. That was something.
Yeah. Yep. They admitted that. So, Doug, and also he references, we didn't know about things like neutral evolution. So I just pulled up a website on that from Quantum Magazine, which I like that. It's a secular magazine, but they have a lot of cool articles.
A lot of creationist writing over there at Quantum.
They don't realize it, but they do help us in different ways. So here's a quote from one of their articles. And the article is, theorists debate how neutral evolution really is. And here's a quote from that. 5 decades after its proposal in the age of cheap genome sequencing, because genome sequencing has become a lot easier, and the tremendous population genomic data sets that we have now, the explanatory power of the neutral theory looks even worse. So, Doug, neutral evolution was never really a good theory. They were trying to get around the problem of harmful mutations, really bringing the genetic load down. It didn't solve the problem, and here's their own evolutionists admitting that. So then later on, he admits that we share 60% of genes with bananas, and onions and strawberries have more DNA in us, and that it's a marvel of life.
Ah, yes. Because marvel, of course, is a scientific term that you use when you're describing meaningless, self-organizing information that mutates with no goal and no pinnacle. It's all a marvel, Fred. It's a marvel the same way that Dr. Chakrabarty swung from the tree of life over to neutral evolution, both which have been recently refuted in his own secular media.
Yeah.
That's a marvel.
Yeah. And where it is a marvel, Doug, obviously from our perspective, it's obvious that it points to a design from a designer who uses common designs. It'd be bad if, like, as an engineer, and if I write some software, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel if I don't need to. Why would I do that? And all engineers work under that paradigm, and God doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. So there are some common designs, and they're extremely elaborate. They're sophisticated, well-structured, multiple application biological systems to meet a whole myriad of biological needs. We've talked about ICR's wonderful work on continuous environmental tracking, how there's more and more evidence that, our bodies take in feedback or input or information from the environment, and the body's designed to adapt to that. I mean, it reminds me of my, I guess you'd call him a cousin-in-law. He works for a prestigious oil firm, and he was in Antarctica for, I think, 2 months. And Doug, it was 0 degrees one day, and they came out of their cave. I don't know what they stay in there, probably some building. They come out at 0 degrees temperature Fahrenheit, and they've got their shirts off, and they're just loving it because their bodies had adapted. And normally it's like -20, -30, but man, when it got up to 0 degrees, they're out there and they're having a great time taking their shirts off. So that's all part of the wonderful design of what God has done. And I also wanted to mention, he then says, the famous 1973 evolutionist canard, that nothing in life makes sense except in light of evolution. And this was Theodoros Dobzhansky, not even sure if I'm saying his name right, but there's a creationist who wrote an article in the CRSQ volume 38, and this is back in 2013. So this would have been, and he titled it appropriately, Dobzhansky, 40 years later, nothing makes sense. And here's a quote from the abstract. The intervening decades have seen his 3 predictions falsified. namely those regarding genetics and the tree of life, the role of evolution theory would play in the progress of biological science, and one particular Arab sheikh whom Dobzhansky identified by name. And we'll talk. I'll just really quickly mention that whole thing about the Arab sheikh. But the author of this paper was none other, Doug, than our own late great Bob Enyart.
That's
who
right.
had this published in the CRSQ. So, yeah, so his prediction, and I'll just read from Bob's paper, it was regarded the sheikh Abdel Aziz bin Baz, and I totally butchered that, which is okay.
We'll just go with Abdul.
Yeah. He had recently insisted that the sun orbited the earth. So Dobzhansky declared that it would be useless to present evidence to those who fear enlightenment, asserting that the sheikh was so hopelessly biased that no amount of evidence would impress him. However, years later, in 1985, the U.S. invited this prince to fly aboard the space shuttle Discovery. And so because of his experience on the Discovery, he later, hearing of the evidence from a source that he trusted, he changed his mind. So that proved Dobzhansky wrong right there. But
Wow.
There's so much more in that paper. We're going to provide a link to it of how this guy was wrong on so many things he talked about.
Yes. Nothing Dobzhansky said makes sense after 40 years, as pointed out by the late, great Bob Enyart.
Yep.
Very cool.
And evolutionists
Very
will
cool.
still talk about how nothing makes sense in biology.
Yeah, you're right. They just used the canard on NPR as if they're not aware that hackneyed old phrase just doesn't work anymore. And then so back to the show. We're taking on NPR Science Friday from last Friday, August 4th, that Chris from Cleveland called in, and he asked why all these smart scientists didn't just start in Genesis, right? Mm-hmm. And he mentions Genesis, and then the host and his guest, Ira and Dr. Chakrabarty, they sort of patronize the caller, but mostly they just set up and tear down a straw man argument.
Yeah, so he basically compares looking to Genesis to ceasing all rational thought. I mean, he said this, quote, "We can just stop studying and leave it at that." And he'll act like he supports people's right to have different beliefs, but he's slamming believers. And then he gives the evolutionist's favorite patronizing line, quote, "We don't have to pick and choose between theistic evolution and creation." And so basically we do. Real Science Radio, that's really one of the backbones of why we have a show.
That's right.
Theistic evolution and young earth creation, they clearly contradict. And, Genesis was written as history. It's so important to realize that we can trust that the earth really is roughly 7,000 years old. God created in 6 literal days. So he created the objects in the sky like the star and the sun on day 4. And the order of creation, it actually all matches science now that we've had so much to look at over the years, Doug. So if you don't believe Genesis is real history, then why believe in things like death is the result of sin? There's so many things that begin to contradict, and atheists often understand the issue better than we do. It's like, okay, what's the whole point of having a savior if you don't have, if death isn't the result of sin? So theistic evolutionists want you to believe in millions and millions and millions of years of death, disease, and suffering, which we see in the fossil record. We see cancer in the fossil record. And so their whole backbone is this whole millions and millions of years of disease, death, and suffering, and it leads to theological decay. Every church, Doug, that we've ever known about that compromises on Genesis, they end up either becoming not a Christian church, or they support things like abortion. They support homosexual marriage. They go down this slippery slope, and it all starts with compromising on Genesis.
Yes.
Look at the genetic. I mean, look at the whole gender identity thing that we're going to get into here in a moment. That was super interesting.
Oh yeah, of course. Yes. So of course, Ira and the good doctor, they encourage Christians to entertain things like gap theory and millions of years, and that creationism and evolution don't contradict. Of course they want Christians to entertain that so that it undermines the foundation of Christianity in the church, because that's what they're all about. And that's why, Fred, you mentioned gender. Ira, of course, then on the show, he has to broach the subject of gender, because at NPR, everything flows from a fountainhead of sexual immorality. And the doctor's Marxist humiliation ritual that he's going through there on NPR, That humiliation ritual would not be complete without making sure that the doctor bows before the altar of gender ideology.
Yeah. And, Doug, I think it's worth playing a quick clip from their podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Because it illustrates how their worldview is so much more steeped in humanism than it is in real science.
Many states have been dealing with anti-LGBTQ bills, and you argue in your book that variations in sex and gender and sexuality can all be explained by evolution. Tell us about that.
Sure, and I'll just start by saying, first, you don't need an evolutionary biologist to tell you that the spectrum and diversity of life includes the spectrum of genders and sexes and sexualities. We can be nice to people and accept people for who they are without an evolutionary biologist telling us, but there is this, we know, across the diversity of life of the species, we know that there are different genders, there's different sexes in species, not everything is male or female, there's many intersex people, there are lots of ways that we can explain gender that are dealing with hormones and not necessarily something that matches your chromosomes or what's in your pants, right? And so our understanding of human sexuality and genders is different than our understanding of how we test and study life on Earth, but it's something that I think people often are asking, why do we have people who aren't part of the reproductive group of people, when they think about evolution. And so for me, it's better for people to have an understanding of this diversity of genders and sexualities and be accepting of it and not use evolution as some way to discredit how people live their lives.
Oh man, Doug, I'm thinking I need to ask our producer of the show to issue barf bags for the studio. That's just hard to stomach.
Man,
so
that is tough to take.
We need to understand diversity of genders and sexuality. Because of evolution, we should be nice to people. It's, here's the translation, Doug. We need to celebrate perversion and mental disease. And that's their worldview. And it's, again, worldviews have consequences. When you believe in this stuff, this is what you come up with. And he goes on to give the illustration of the clownfish. And I have a couple of those in my saltwater tank. And basically, he mentions how they start off as male. And then there's going to be one dominant clownfish that emerges. It's going to be the female. And Doug, this doesn't equate to humans at all. Now, I don't know about you, Doug. No. I've never met a guy who became a woman through these gender mutilations.
Yeah, no.
And somehow has a kid. Do you know of any examples? I've never seen one in my life. I've never heard of one. And if there was one, guess what? That person would be all over the media.
Yeah,
it's just such a ridiculous analogy. And again, it shows you where that type of worldview, where this leads. They're using evolution to justify this whole nonsense with gender identity and gender mutilation, frankly.
Yeah. Basically beclowning themselves over the clownfish.
So, Doug, we're actually getting really close to out of time, but there's a few more bullet points. I just want to run through them quick so that we can provide our refutations of all these through our website.
Yeah, we'll have to go quick because we certainly don't want to inflict the actual listening of the show on people. So run through them for us, Fred.
Yeah, so... Okay, we already talked about how one of the callers asked the question, do apes and zoos become human? And the good doctor says, well, no, but evolution, he does say evolution is progressive. So to address that, I want to quote from a recent study published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. And what they did was they compared genomes of over 100 organisms, mostly animals, to study how the animal kingdom has evolved at the genetic level. And here's the quote: our results show that the origins of major groups of animals, such as the one comprising humans, are linked not to the addition of new genes, but to massive gene losses. Wow. So evolution is progressive. Doug, this fits exactly what us creationists have been saying all along. God created a perfect world, and then sin and death entered the world, and now the creation is deteriorating, as the Bible says, to this day. If you read Romans 8, verses 19 through 23. We know that the whole creation has been groaning together as it suffers together the pains of labor, and not only the creation, but ourselves. So the creation is deteriorating. We were created with the maximum amount of information. And then over time, as the genetic load increases, as mutations increase, we become slightly more bad off each generation. We slightly deteriorate each generation. And so we're losing information. It's becoming slightly more scrambled. Now, God has an elaborate quality control system that combats this, but there's still the ones that slip through and we deteriorate over time, and it's all part of the fall. And really, this quote from the Science Journal, again, and we'll provide a link to it, it fits exactly the creationist worldview. So evolution isn't progressive like he likes to say. That's just not true. This one caller mentioned AI, which was really silly. He's been watching too many Terminator movies. We'll skip that one. We already talked about the clownfish, and then one teacher asked him to explain giraffes, and I love that one. If you remember, I have a website, the Exploding Giraffe Head. How does a giraffe evolve? And they never got into the details of that. He just simply said there's competition with siblings for resources. So it's all survival of the fittest, which is a tautology. It's circular reasoning. And he says that the taller giraffes can reach the highest leaves, and so then they are better likely to survive. Again, it's a trust issue, Doug. They want our trust. And what was really bad, he even says, too bad for the shorter kids. I mean,
and by the way, Fred, it's like planting the idea in kids' heads that death is simply a mechanism of life. Like it's good, like death is good. It's just a part of what's happening. It's very evil.
Yeah, it is. And the Bible says death is the last enemy that will be destroyed. They can't explain how sex itself evolved. I mean, we've got elaborate mechanisms, Doug, to prevent things like polyspermy. Polyspermy is really bad. When it happens, then the baby doesn't survive. It can't. So there's this mechanism that only allows one sperm in. Once the sperm fertilizes the egg, there's this thing that happens that shuts down everybody else from entering in. It's a really cool engineering system. That is a whole nother topic. It'd be fun to get into at some time. Finally, at the end of the show, a guy named Nathan from Springfield, Missouri, and I lived in Springfield for like 4 years. It's fairly conservative there. He mentions epigenetics. It's that great topic that the guys over at ICR are talking a lot about now. Go to the ICR website. We've got a link to their work on continuous environmental tracking. And they explain how cavefish didn't become blind because of natural selection and mutation over many generations. It can happen in one generation because God programmed it that way. It's all really cool stuff, Doug.
Go there. It's way better than listening to NPR, which was horrible. Yeah, please just mention to your friend. Mention to your friend in Boulder, Fred. God bless him. We love him. Please don't ever do that to me again. To make me have to listen to a half hour.
Yeah, so Ralph, you're listening. Yeah. Anyways, but we actually really appreciate it because we got a chance to rebut their latest and greatest, and it was so easy to do. It's like, can you throw me a softer pitch than that one? I want to quote from the Bible to end this, Doug, because this professor and Ira Flatow, they fall in the category of teachers. I mean, they're teaching this stuff to people in the world.
That's right.
And remember what James 3:1 said. A lot of times Christians take this verse as just speaking to Christians, but no, it speaks to everybody. Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. So just don't think that God's just going to, because it said, my brothers, he is saying that to his fellow believers. But you don't think God is also going to hold this standard to those in the world? It'd be better to strap a millstone around your neck than to deceive these little children. Doug, I don't want to be these guys on Judgment Day. Hopefully they're listening to this and they, at some point, the seeds planted that realize what they're doing is a great harm to the world. It's evil. And they will be accountable for it. They're not going to be able to vote this stuff off the island. They're going to meet their creator someday.
Yeah, and hopefully Dr. Chakrabarty comes to an understanding that the worldview that he's espousing in order to achieve what he's achieved in this life, everything he's achieved in this life is going to come to nothing. And what's going to matter is what happens to him in eternity. and hopefully he will come to realize that he's been deceived and he's now deceiving and he needs to repent.
Yeah, and I'm going back, Doug, to his quote earlier in the show where he said, they will believe it despite the evidence. That you need to apply that same thing, look at before you remove the plank in your eye, before you tell us to remove the plank in our eye, you need to find that big old log in your eye where your mind is. Are you really going to change your mind based on all the evidence that refutes everything you said on this show? Really precisely. A lot of the refutations are from your scientists in your own community. So, Doug, it was such an honor having you on the show to go through this with Real Science Radio as our esteemed co-host. Your insight into the Marxist part of this was really interesting to me.
I'm hoping that might be what reaches this doctor's mind. I mean, I don't know. He may be too brainwashed, but the fact that he's forced to say these things and bow down before these idols, you would think that would wake up someone who has excelled in rational thought and science. You'd think that he would realize that now he's having to deny sex is sex. Well, in biology, really?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully that would wake him up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Doug, National Public Radio, they get a lot of funding from the government. They have tons of resources, lots of money. We at Real Science Radio, we have just you listeners. So to help us stay on the air and be able to continue to get this truth out, to get real science out on Friday, and for you to listen to anytime you want, please go to rstar.org/store. We've got a lot of great materials. Or if you just want to help us out monthly or yearly or with one-time donation, you can go to rstar.org/donation. And please help us out. You can you can sponsor a show.
Yeah.
And that's always helps us a lot. So again, please go to rstar.org/store. We definitely need your help. We don't have the U.S. government funding us. I'm looking at my producer. We're not getting checks from Uncle Sam, are we? He said zero. Okay.
None.
So, okay. Thanks again, Doug. So for Doug McBurney, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.